Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Planning Applications Considerations for Retrofit Program Masterclass. My name is Nathan McLaughlin. I'm Managing Director of McLaughlin Planning. I'm a planning consultant with over 25 years worth of experience in both public and private sector. I've been running my own company for the past 13 and a half years. So in terms of this afternoon's presentation, this slide obviously highlights what the structure of the masterclass is. Now, planning is an incredibly broad subject, and really the key takeaways I want you to hopefully get from this presentation is really just to give you a canter through some of the basic planning implications for retrofit programs and get you used to some of the terminology that will be used when you are engaging with the planning process. So this is just meant as a sort of general introduction to the whole planning process. So in terms of structure today, we're focusing on what is planning, procedure of how to make a planning application, technical aspects of permitted development rights, or PDRs, as they will get referred to during the course of the presentation, and really the key message here about how to take planning into account in your programs. And with having some of the technical knowledge which I'm sharing with you today, hopefully you'll have a much better idea of what potential damage that can do to your programs. So moving on, what is are now, essentially, it's a process by which the development of land and buildings throughout the country is regulated. There are essentially the planning process across England, Scotland, and Wales is broadly the same, but there are subtle nuances between the three of them. Crucially, planning is not about building regulations. Utilities consents, personal circumstances, however compelling they may be, the planning system does not you have to have a very high bar for personal circumstances to be a consideration in the planning process. Legal property matters, so covenants and ownerships, you can submit a planning application on property that you do not own and is subject to a restricted covenant. And in theory, planning permission can be granted for that. The fact there may be a covenant or an ownership issue doesn't prevent planning permission from being granted. Also, planning doesn't take into account any construction program. So and the reason why I highlight that is from a third party point of view, there's obviously people have a lot of concerns, and there's typically some complaints about construction traffic or the noise and the implications of having contractors on site. That from a planning standpoint is just a temporary issue, and it looks to manage the impacts arising from the construction program, but the construction program itself will not determine whether planning permission will or will not be granted. So with that in mind, I really have to sort of discount those 5 bullet points. Building regulations is obviously important, and what I would say is the environmental performance of buildings now is very high on the political agenda, especially with every local authority in the country declaring a climate emergency. And what we're starting to see now from a planning standpoint is authorities flexing their muscles in terms of asking for higher levels of energy performance, whether that's through installation of external wall insulation or air source heat pumps, photovoltaic, solar thermal, or whatever. And you're taking all that totally laudable and understandable policy direction from the climate emergency, and it's then meeting what the traditional planning considerations are about impact on the character and appearance of the area. So that's sort of something that's very much an emerging theme. So moving on, really want to break this presentation down into 2 key parts. The first part is the planning application process, and then permitted development rights. So in terms of dealing with planning applications, unfortunately, we're in an environment at the moment where local authorities, their planning departments are seriously under a significant amount of stress in terms of officer availability and workload. This has been exacerbated by the pandemic, and it wasn't and the key point to make is it wasn't in a particularly good position going into the pandemic. And we know there are some extremely good officers out there who are incredibly overworked, as much as there are those that are sort of making life difficult for themselves. So what I would advocate as a key takeaway today is the need to seek professional advice early, whether that's through the appointment of a planning consultant. And essentially our job, and this isn't a plug, if you will, but our job is to represent your development aspirations through the planning process. It is our job to secure as a planning consultant, to secure you planning permission, or whether if you are working for a local authority, have that discussion with the head of service in the planning department, make them aware of what you are wanting to do and the timeframes in which you are wanting to do it. Get that done now, because what it does is it starts to save time coming, once you get into the planning process. So in terms of the whole engaging with the planning process, the first thing is you need to obviously have a clear understanding of what you want to achieve in terms of retrofitting. The second question is, do you actually need planning permission for that? Now, this deals with permitted development rights, which is sort of the second half of this. And that's the next bullet point. Now, it is quite possible to check whether you need planning permission or not, or you benefit from PD rights. And part of this talk will focus on how you do that. And then the final point about the planning engagement process is, will I get planning permission for what I want to achieve? So with your goal set, it actually then needs to be sense checked in terms of what process you need to go through to secure the necessary consent. But then equally at the end of it, there's this fundamental question of whether you will actually get planning permission for what you want to do. Because if the answer to that is no, then there is little point in proceeding with the planning application, and you have to essentially revisit your aspirations. So, moving on to how a typical planning application works, it's basically set out in 6 steps. So, step 1, initial work completed. That's very much formulating what you want to achieve, and whether it needs planning permission or not. That's sort of done as the first stage of internal sense checking. The second point is essentially engaging with your local planning authority's planning department on seeking pre-application advice. It varies from authority to authority in terms of how they manage these processes, and typically there is a charge for pre-application advice. Now, depending on the number of properties you are looking to do in your given areas, it would be highly advisable to have quite a serious conversation with the planning department concerned about logistically how to manage all those applications. So a pre-app goes into the council. They normally have a service protocol of typically 20 working days, which unfortunately varies wildly from authority to authority and their ability to hit it. And what you are asking at pre-app is fundamentally, I've identified a need for planning permission for this. What are the chances of securing planning permission? Is the pre-app process in a nutshell. The outcome from the pre-app process is essentially a letter, email, Teams meeting with the planning officers concerned. Essentially, it's a sort of go, no go checkpoint of, yes, you do need planning permission for this. We agree with this. We've assessed the proposal, and officers are willing to support the application. It's the sort of the main objective. The alternative is where you get the no go or red light from the council, and that's when officers turn around and say, no, we would not support this proposal. And they would then go on, one would hope, to explain the reasons why they wouldn't support that proposal. Now, critically, if the response from the council is negative, that they should justify it. That gives you the ability to assess what's being said, and then see if the planning officer's right in the first instance, and then secondly, adapt your strategy accordingly. The thing I should say about pre-application advice response is this is not binding on the authority. It is simply an officer's opinion. And from my perspective, over my 25 years of practice, there have been instances where there's been simply a change in officer, and the officer has a polar opposite opinion on the proposal that his colleague would have given pre-application advice on. It does happen. It's a risk. Mercifully, it's not terribly common, but it does cause a lot of problems when it does. So assuming a positive pre-app, you prepare the planning application and submit it to the local planning authority, and I'll come on to how that's done in a minute. The local planning authority, or LPA, sorry, I should explain the three-letter acronyms, for a retrofit project will have an 8-week determination period, and that's a statutory determination period by which they've got the luxury of making a decision within that time. Now, during the 8-week determination period, typically the first 4 weeks of the application's life, not much happens because the officers are just getting consultation responses in. It's once the 4-week period has passed, then the application is moving to that point of being able to be determined. And the outcomes from any application is planning permission is granted, obviously fantastic, that's what we're all aiming for. Planning permission is refused, that's unfortunate. You look at the reasons why it was refused, and then if it is refused, you go to appeal. And there is a whole process set up of where an independent government inspector is appointed to look at your case. Now, the one thing I should also add on the outcomes is, given the stress and strain the planning system is under at the moment, sometimes authorities don't make decisions within the 8-week period, and sometimes decisions just quite seriously go to ground, never to be seen for months. You do have the right to appeal on the grounds of non-determination, i.e. the failure of the council to make a decision. So you can go to appeal if nothing happens. It's quite rare for projects of this magnitude, but it is certainly an option that's open to you. So in terms of submitting a planning application, everything, for those who aren't aware, and I appreciate some of you will be fully aware of this, everything is done via the planning portal. It's the online system for submitting planning applications, and it's a very easy process to follow in terms of just essentially filling in the various boxes and questions that get asked and upload plans. But the key thing here is you will need scale plans of the site, including elevations existing and proposed, a site plan, and other supporting material as relevant. Now, this is in reference to the local planning authority's validation checklist, which is their prescribed list of things they want in order for a planning application to be found valid. So once you submit an application, it has to be checked by the council as to whether it can be valid. And that means meeting some of the basic data requirements of application form, obviously, and elevations, proposed and existing, site plan, and anything else that occurs. A good example I always have is we did an application for an air source heat pump installation in one of the London boroughs. We had proposed and existing elevations of the property, site plan, and schematics for the air source heat pump as provided by the manufacturer. What we were subsequently asked for was a noise impact assessment for the air source heat pump, which we hadn't anticipated, to be fair, but this is a piece of equipment that's being installed in the middle of London, where it's already in quite a noisy urban environment. And this piece of equipment is designed to be used in a domestic context. So we had to push back a bit against the authority in terms of actually providing one of these, because the manufacturer's details, which we had submitted, had provided a full specification of the noise levels being generated by the machinery. And then obviously the final bullet point of the key component of the planning application is paying the fees to the relevant local planning authority. The planning portal will not send your application to the local planning authority concerned without the fee being paid. So it is important in your programming that if you have to go through a rather laborious accounts process in terms of raising an invoice for getting the planning application fee paid, then that is done at the earliest possible stage, just to make everything a lot smoother. We've dealt with clients, predominantly commercial ones over the years, whereby the project managers got to the point of having the planning application submitted, and then it's realised it's going to take him 3 weeks for the accounts team to put the necessary procedures in place to allow a payment to be made to the local planning authority through the planning portal via their web-based system. So that's always just a minor detail and just something to bear in mind. So in terms of the, this is sort of the last slide on planning applications. General points to note are a planning application is on a site-by-site basis. So if you have got 50 properties you are pursuing your retrofit project on, you have to submit 50 different planning applications for those. Unfortunately, it's one of the difficulties of the process. The second one is really just what I've highlighted on the previous slide, is the 8-week period doesn't start until the fee is paid and the application is subsequently validated. Now, the key point with this is it's the point where if the application was received by the council on day one, and it takes them 3 weeks to validate the application, and it's found valid 3 weeks later, the 8-week period starts the day the council received the application. So essentially, the council have lost 3 weeks, and it's just an unfortunate situation when at the moment that validation is taking a long time. And it's something to bear in mind that once the application goes in, either yourselves, if you're managing the applications directly, or your agent, whoever that may be, continues to press the authority for the rapid validation of the application, rather than it just being stuck in this sort of ether, if you will, of it's not an application, that it's not yet going anywhere. So hopefully this is still giving you an idea of just how a planning application process works. What I want to move on to now is what's known as permitted development rights, or PDRs for short. And what I've highlighted is the Town and Country Planning General Permitted Development England Order 2015. And this is the key document by which it sets out what you can and cannot do without planning permission. So if you think back to the earlier slide, at the very outset of your retrofitting project, you've obviously got to establish a vision of what you want to achieve with each one of your properties. Your starting point is to determine whether planning permission is required. This document tells you what you can and cannot do without planning permission. So it's a sort of number one go-to, and if you just type that into Google, it's there for all to see. It is amended, and it has been amended on several subsequent occasions, but none of the amendments reflect on any of the various parts I'm going to talk about now. And what I've done is, what you need to do is pay attention to what's known as Schedule 2, Part 1, Part 2, and Part 14. Now, Part 1 deals with alterations to dwelling houses, and I'll come on to that in a second. Part 2 is simply EV charging points, and Part 3 is all renewable technologies. So moving on to the first permitted development right, Part 1 classes A, B, and C. This is all relating to development within the curtilage of a dwelling house. And the key point here is to point out that a dwelling house is not a flat or an apartment. And the main focus of this is picking up on how this class relates to an external wall insulation. Now, what I found from other masterclasses that I've run on it when we've been debating this whole point about EWI is that Class A allows for enlargement, improvement, or other alteration of a dwelling house, and that's a very sort of high level right, and it's subject to a lot of provisos, if you will, which are followed up in the foundation masterclass, which I also run. Now, the extension of a property in terms of putting external wall insulation on certain elevations of a building is not necessarily considered to require planning permission from a technical standpoint because it's a home improvement. What we're finding, and what other delegates are finding when we have this conversation at the end of these presentations, is that local authorities are asking for external wall insulation proposals to be subject to planning applications, irrespective of what detailed technical guidance says. In terms of classes B and C, these are just alterations and additions to the roof, and there can be the right, there's actually quite a wide-ranging right to alter the roofs or re-roof buildings without the requirement for planning permission. The final point I want to make here is, this final bullet point is, external wall insulation rights can be limited by areas of outstanding natural beauty, conservation areas, and Article 4 designations. Now, this is primarily because especially reskinning a property doesn't automatically require planning permission. But in those areas, they have been into the permitted development right is completely removed. It's non-negotiable. So I'm talking to you today from Cheltenham in Gloucestershire, and we have one of the largest single conservation areas in the country, and it covers a multitude of different building styles and multitude of different building ages as well. Because everything's in the conservation area, the ability to essentially re-render the front of one's house, if you will, irrespective of what else you want to do to it, simply ceases to exist, and it requires planning permission. So, moving on from alterations and enlargements to dwelling house, I want to move on to EV charging points, which is covered by part 2, classes D and E. Now, very simply, given the impending ban on internal combustion engines being brought in by the government, there is a wide range, the right to install either a electrical, or basically called a pod point on a building, or an upstand for charging is, that's actually quite straightforward, very, very permissive. The only issues are proximity to the highway and listed building and scheduled ancient monument issues. If you are a listed building or a scheduled ancient monument, you can't do it without seeking the necessary consent. And that's as far as the right goes. Moving on to the installation of renewable technologies under Part 14, you can obviously see the list of technologies which are all permissible. I'm not entirely sure why there's a slight difference between various types of biomass, CHP flue or a biomass flue, but the only one I want to sort of focus on here is air source heat pumps, because obviously there's been a lot in the press recently about these. They are permitted development, but the issues you have to be careful with are the proximity of the air source heat pump installation to the curtilage or boundary of the property. If it's within 2 meters of the boundary of the property, it will automatically require planning permission. And this is probably one of the issues, one of the difficulties of retrofitting, in terms of installing an air source heat pump is obviously being installed into a property that was not necessarily inherently designed to accommodate that in its garden in the first instance. So it's something you need to be acutely conscious of when planning that sort of installation. So in terms of, just an overview, permitted development rights and the general permitted development law it's extremely complex, and this is something we advise a lot on. What I've tried to get, what I'd like to think you're taking away today is just an understanding of some of the terminology in terms of PDRs and the GPDO, and where you can find those rights and read up on them yourselves, and hopefully it'll become very apparent very quickly. It does turn on the use of grammar. The use of and or, it has a dramatic effect on whether a right exists or not. Now, if a proposal doesn't benefit from permitted development rights, very simply, it needs planning permission, and you go through the planning application process. However, if it does benefit from permitted development rights, you can seek a certificate of lawful development, and essentially that is the council confirming with you that it agrees that the proposal does not require planning permission. It follows exactly the same process as a planning application, insofar as the council has 8 weeks to determine it. but it is simply the council checking the regulations to confirm this position. The benefit of having these is that it provides absolute certainty that your retrofit project does have an approval paperwork. So if there are any third-party concerns, complaints, the enforcement team at the council can simply check the planning records for the site and see that a certificate of lawful development is in place and you are indemnified from enforcement action. So to recap, why is planning important to your program? I mean, as I've said on several occasions through the course of this presentation, the system is under extreme stress, and with the greatest respect to my colleagues in the public sector, I can't see that getting any better at all for the time being. And their applications, simply put, they're not being determined within 8 weeks. Now, if you need an application determined in 8 weeks, that's going to be very, very difficult for you to achieve. I would strongly suggest that you discuss this with your local authority at length. So really what we've got to look at is protecting your retrofitting projects from the time delays of the planning process. And this goes back to early professional advice to understand the planning risks, whether you benefit from permitted development rights or whether you don't and planning permission is required. If you benefit from PDRs and you have professional advice to that extent, whilst that professional advice from a third party is no substitute for a certificate of lawful development, at least it gives you the option of whether you can decide whether you want to proceed without getting the certificate of lawful development in place. Another point on the implications planning has, if you have to take into account the planning committee cycle, which is often sort of the silent issue in getting an application away. If there are third-party objections, some local authorities require applications automatically to go to committee for determination. There's also need potentially for community consultations, just depending on how big your schemes are. They need to be factored into the timetable. Now, if you get to the end of, if you get to 7 week mark and is suddenly the application's got to go to committee, odds on that will add at least another 4 weeks to your project program in terms of getting planning permission. Now, the penultimate bullet point is any breach of planning control, which goes back to this issue of lawful development certificates. You will have a visit from a planning enforcement officer. They will be responding to third-party complaints, and very simply, their job is to determine whether planning permission is required and how it needs to be regularized. Now, it's a very straightforward process. A visit from an enforcement officer doesn't set you back. It's not a black mark against you or the site. It doesn't colour the way the application should be determined. Essentially, the enforcement officer's job is to ensure that planning control is upheld. And in the first instance, they will invite you to submit a planning application. I would strongly advise that that happens. And really, the final point I want to just stress, we're picking up on the first one, is with the greatest respect again to my public sector colleagues, the planning department is not there to make shortfalls in your project programming. If you want to achieve something in an impossible time frame, based on the fact the council has got to have 8 weeks to determine that planning application, I would automatically build that into any program and probably at least another 4 weeks for either side of it for some flexibility. And that's as a conservative estimate. You can push officers to try and make decisions as quickly as possible, but it's that fine balance of maintaining a positive relationship with officers, and especially if you're submitting multiple applications in the given local authority area. But please be acutely aware of the delays that currently exist in the system. So that's the presentation.